The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the general store in Medicine Bow, Wyoming, and Eliza Fairmont stepped down onto the dusty street with legs that barely held her weight after 3 weeks of travel, her entire body tensing when the driver's hand reached out to steady her elbow. She jerked away instinctively, nearly stumbling, and saw the flash of confusion cross his weathered face before she mumbled an apology and hurried toward the boardwalk with her carpetbag clutched against her chest like a shield. The October air of 1878 carried the scent of pine from the mountains rising to the west, and she breathed it in, trying to calm the racing of her heart as she surveyed the small frontier town that would be her new home, her escape from everything that had broken her back in St. Louis. The general store smelled of coffee and leather and sawdust, and the woman behind the counter looked up with kind eyes that immediately softened when she took in Eliza's pale face and the way she stood near the door as though ready to bolt. "You must be Miss Fairmont," the woman said gently, coming around the counter but stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm Margaret Dawson. My husband and I own this store. We got your letter saying you'd be arriving to take the teaching position." Eliza nodded, forcing her voice to work. "Thank you for holding it for me. I know it was unusual, my applying from so far away." "We're just grateful to have someone educated willing to come this far west," Margaret said, and her eyes held questions she was too polite to ask about why a refined young woman of 22 would travel alone to a remote Wyoming territory town. "The schoolhouse is ready for you. It's small, but there's living quarters attached. I've put together some supplies to get you started." They spoke for a few more minutes about practical matters, about where to draw water, and when the children would start coming for lessons, and Eliza felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease at Margaret's careful distance, the way she seemed to understand without being told that Eliza needed space. When a shadow fell across the doorway, though, Eliza's breath caught, and she took an instinctive step backward. The man who entered had to duck his head to clear the frame, and he seemed to fill the entire store with his presence. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they strained against his buckskin shirt, and his hair fell past his collar in waves of dark brown that looked as though he cut it himself with a hunting knife. His face was weathered and strong, all hard angles and a jaw dark with several days' growth of beard, and his eyes were a startling clear gray that swept the room with the wariness of a man who had lived too long in wild places. When those eyes landed on Eliza, she saw him take in her defensive posture, the way her knuckles had gone white on her bag, and something shifted in his expression that she could not quite name. "Harrison," Margaret said with obvious relief. "Good timing. This is Miss Fairmont, our new schoolteacher. Miss Fairmont, this is Harrison Quinn. He has a cabin up in the mountains about 10 miles north, brings us furs and game when he comes to town." Harrison Quinn removed his hat, revealing more of that wild hair, and gave a slight nod. "Madam." His voice was deep and rough, as though he did not use it often, and Eliza noticed he made no move to approach her, no offer to shake her hand, though his eyes never left her face with an intensity that made her want to look away but somehow could not. "Mr. Quinn," she managed, and saw something flicker in those gray eyes at her tight, formal tone. "Harrison brought in some venison," Margaret continued, seemingly unaware of the strange tension in the room. "I was thinking you might take some for your pantry, Miss Fairmont. Fresh meat keeps better in this cold weather, and Harrison's the best hunter in 3 counties. Eliza wanted to refuse, wanted no ties or obligations to this mountain of a man who looked at her as though he could see straight through to all her broken pieces, but she also knew she needed to be practical. "That's very kind. What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Harrison said simply, and when she opened her mouth to protest, he added, "Welcome gift. Town needs a teacher." He turned to Margaret. "I'll drop it by the schoolhouse this afternoon if that suits." Margaret glanced at Eliza, who felt trapped but nodded. "That would be fine, thank you." Harrison put his hat back on, gave another slight nod, and left as silently as he had come. Eliza let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "He seems frightening at first," Margaret said quietly, beginning to pack supplies into a crate. "But Harrison's got a good heart. He helped build that schoolhouse with his own 2 hands, wouldn't take any payment for it. Said children needed a proper place to learn." She paused, measuring coffee into a cloth sack. "He doesn't come to town often, prefers the solitude of the mountains. But when he does, folks know they can count on him." Eliza said nothing, because what could she say? That even good men frightened her now. That the way Harrison had looked at her had made her feel seen in a way that terrified her more than anything else. She accepted Margaret's help in carrying supplies to the small schoolhouse at the edge of town, and she tried not to think about gray eyes and broad shoulders, and the careful way he had kept his distance, as though he had understood something about her that she had never spoken aloud. The schoolhouse was simple but sturdy. One large room with a pot-bellied stove and rows of handmade desks, and the attached living quarters consisted of a single room with a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove. It was more than Eliza had expected, and she felt something almost like hope stir in her chest as she unpacked her few belongings. She was hanging her 2 dresses in the small wardrobe when she heard footsteps on the porch, heavy and measured, and her entire body went rigid. She forced herself to move to the door, forced herself to open it, and found Harrison Quinn standing there with a haunch of venison wrapped in clean cloth. He was even larger up close, all muscle and strength that spoke of a life lived wrestling with mountains and wilderness, and Eliza had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She saw him register how she had positioned herself half behind the door, how her hand trembled slightly on the handle. "Where would you like it?" he asked, making no move to enter. "I can take it," Eliza said quickly, reaching out, but the meat was heavy and her arms were not prepared for the weight. She fumbled, nearly dropping it, and Harrison's hands came up automatically to steady it, his fingers brushing hers for just an instant. Eliza flinched so hard she actually stumbled backward, and the venison would have hit the floor if Harrison had not caught it with reflexes faster than should be possible for a man his size. For a long moment they stood frozen, Eliza pressed against the wall, breathing too fast, Harrison in the doorway holding the meat with his face carefully expressionless. Then he slowly, deliberately, took 2 steps backward off the porch, putting distance between them. "I'll leave it here on the rail," he said quietly, setting it down. "Stay fresh in this cold until you can store it proper." He paused, and those gray eyes were too knowing, too gentle. "You need anything else, Miss Fairmont, Margaret knows how to reach me." He left before Eliza could formulate a response, his long strides carrying him quickly down the dirt road toward the edge of town, where she could see a massive bay horse tied outside the saloon. She watched him mount in one fluid motion, watched him ride north toward the mountains, and only then did she retrieve the venison with shaking hands and carry it inside. That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town settling into darkness, Eliza let herself cry for the first time since leaving St. Louis. She cried for the girl she had been before her stepfather's brother had come to stay in their house, before those 6 months of hell that had ended only when she had finally found the courage to tell her mother, only to be called a liar and a seductress, and thrown out with nothing but her mother's hatred ringing in her ears. She cried for the innocence she had lost, for the way her own body had become her enemy, flinching away from every kind touch because her mind could no longer tell the difference between kindness and cruelty. And she cried because some part of her, some stupid, broken part of her, had noticed the way Harrison Quinn's hands had been scarred and calloused but gentle, the way he had understood her fear without her having to explain it, the way he had given her space as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The next morning, she washed her face in cold water from the pump out back, braided her honey-colored hair into a neat coronet, and put on her best dress to greet the children who would be her students. They came in ones and twos throughout the morning, ranging from 6 to 14 years old, some shy and some bold, all curious about the new teacher who spoke with a refined accent and had books they had never seen before. Eliza felt herself relax into the familiar rhythm of teaching, felt purpose kindle inside her as she assessed their abilities and began to plan lessons. The days developed a pattern. She taught 6 days a week, Sunday being the only day of rest, and slowly began to know the families of Medicine Bow through their children. Margaret Dawson became a friend, stopping by with fresh bread or just conversation, always careful to knock and wait to be invited in, always respectful of Eliza's need for space. Other women in town were kind if curious, and Eliza learned to deflect questions about her past with vague mentions of family difficulties and a desire for a fresh start. Harrison Quinn she did not see again for 3 weeks. Then one Saturday morning in early November, she was drawing water from the pump when she heard the sound of an axe biting into wood. She turned to see him in the small yard behind the schoolhouse, splitting logs into firewood with a rhythm and efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of practice. He had removed his buckskin shirt despite the cold, wearing only a thin undershirt that clung to the muscles of his back and arms as he worked, and Eliza found herself staring at the sheer physical power in every movement before she caught herself and looked away, heat flooding her face. She approached cautiously, staying several yards back. "Mr. Quinn." He paused mid-swing, turned to face her, and she saw sweat on his brow despite the November chill. "Miss Fairmont, Margaret mentioned you were running low on firewood. Figured I'd take care of it while I was in town." "That's very kind, but I don't want to take advantage, no advantage," he interrupted gently. "I was splitting wood anyway. Not much harder to do a bit more." He drove the axe into the stump he was using as a base and reached for his shirt, pulling it on with movements that were oddly careful, as though he was aware of her discomfort with his partial state of undress. "I'll stack it against the wall when I'm done. Won't bother you." Eliza wanted to say he was not bothering her, but that felt too revealing, so she simply nodded. She went back inside but found herself unable to concentrate on the arithmetic exercises she had been preparing. Instead, she kept glancing out the window at the rhythmic rise and fall of the axe, at the way Harrison moved with the unself-conscious grace of a wild animal, completely at home in his body and his strength in a way that fascinated her. When he finished, she heard him stacking the wood with the same quiet efficiency, and she made a decision that terrified her. She filled a cup with water from the pump and carried it out to where he was brushing bark chips from his hands. "You must be thirsty," she said, holding out the cup but keeping several feet between them. Harrison looked at the cup, then at her face, and something shifted in his expression that was almost like wonder. "Thank you," he said quietly. He closed the distance slowly, telegraphing every movement, and took the cup with care not to let his fingers touch hers. He drank deeply, never taking his eyes from her face, and when he handed it back he was equally careful. "Good water, cold and clean." "The well is deep," Eliza said inanely, cursing herself for not being able to manage normal conversation. Deep is good. Won't run dry come summer. He paused, and she saw him choosing his words. You settling in all right, town treating you well? Yes, very well. The children are wonderful. Eager to learn. That's good. Another pause. Winter comes hard up here. You need anything, you tell Margaret. She knows how to reach me. You've said that before, Eliza said before she could stop herself. Why do you keep offering to help someone you don't know? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Maybe because you look like someone who's had too little help when she needed it, he said finally, and the gentle understanding in his voice made Eliza's throat tight. And maybe because every person deserves to know there are folks they can count on, no questions asked. He picked up his axe, gave her a slight nod, and walked away before Eliza could think of how to respond to that. She stood in the cold November air holding an empty cup, and feeling as though something inside her had cracked open just a little, letting in light for the first time in a very long while. Winter descended on Medicine Bow with a ferocity that surprised Eliza despite Margaret's warnings. Snow began falling in mid-November and did not stop for 3 days, piling in drifts against the schoolhouse and making the walk to the general store an ordeal. The children still came to lessons bundled in so many layers they could barely move, and Eliza kept the pot-bellied stove burning hot, grateful for the stacks of firewood Harrison had provided. She did not see him again for weeks, and she told herself the disappointment she felt was absurd, that she had no claim on a mountain man who had shown her a few kindnesses, that her stupid, broken mind needed to stop fixating on the memory of gray eyes and gentle words. But still, she found herself looking up hopefully whenever she heard horses in the street, found herself asking Margaret with studied casualness whether Harrison came to town often in winter. Not usually, Margaret said, measuring out flour for Eliza's monthly supplies. Once the snows really set in, he tends to stay up at his cabin until spring. The trails get too dangerous. She glanced at Eliza with knowing eyes. He came down twice last month, though, more than usual. Wanted to make sure everyone had enough meat and firewood put by before the worst of winter hit. Eliza felt her face heat and busied herself examining a bolt of fabric. That's very conscientious of him. He's a good man, Margaret said quietly. Came out here about 5 years ago from somewhere back east. Never talks about why, but then, lots of folks come west to leave things behind. He built that cabin with his own hands, lives alone except for his horse and a mule. Makes a living trapping and hunting, brings the furs to sell in spring. She paused. Some of the ladies in town have tried to catch his interest over the years. He's always polite, but he never shows any particular favor. I think he's been waiting for someone who sees past the rough exterior to the gentle heart underneath. Margaret, Eliza started, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I know, Margaret said gently. I know you're not ready for that kind of thinking. I just wanted you to know that if someday you are ready, you could do a lot worse than a man who cuts your firewood and leaves you space to breathe. That night, a blizzard screamed down from the mountains, and Eliza huddled close to her stove listening to the wind howl and hoping the schoolhouse walls would hold. She woke to silence and opened her door to a world transformed. Snow piled so high against the north wall that it reached the windows, the entire landscape glittering white under a pale blue sky. School was canceled that day, and the next while men worked to clear the main street, and Eliza spent the time reading and preparing lessons, and trying not to feel the weight of isolation. On the third day, she heard someone shoveling outside, and she opened the door to find Harrison Quinn clearing a path from her door to the street, moving snow in great heaps with a determination that spoke of hours of work. Mr. Quinn, she called, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. He looked up, face red from exertion, and she saw relief flash across his features. "Morning, Miss Fairmont. Wanted to make sure you weren't snowed in. Some of the smaller buildings got it worse than others." "I'm fine, but you didn't needed doing," he said simply, going back to work. "Can't have the teacher trapped in her house. Children need their learning." Eliza watched him work for a few minutes, then made another decision that frightened her. She went inside and put coffee on to boil, and when she brought a cup out to him, she held it out with hands that barely trembled. Harrison stared at the cup, as though she had offered him something far more precious than coffee. He set down his shovel and took it with the same careful avoidance of touching her that he always showed. But this time, their eyes met and held, and Eliza saw in his face that he understood exactly what it cost her to make this small gesture. "Thank you," he said, his rough voice even rougher with emotion. "That's mighty kind. It's the least I can do when you've been working for hours. Not hours, maybe one." He sipped the coffee and closed his eyes briefly. "That's good, real good." They stood in the cold morning air, snow glittering around them, and Eliza felt something shift between them, some new understanding taking shape. "Why do you do this?" she asked quietly. "Help people who never ask for it." Harrison took another sip of coffee, his gray eyes distant. "I came out here 5 years ago with nothing but a horse and what I could carry in my saddlebags," he said slowly. "Was running from some things that seemed like they'd swallow me whole if I stayed back east. Found a valley up in the mountains, built a cabin, figured I'd live alone and die alone and that'd be enough." He paused, looking at her. "First winter I got careless, broke my leg in 3 places when my horse spooked near a ravine, crawled back to my cabin, figured that was the end. Then a Shoshone man found me, brought his wife, and they stayed with me for 2 weeks until I could walk again. Never asked why I was alone, never asked what I was running from, just helped because I needed help." Eliza felt her throat tighten. "What happened to them?" "They come by every spring," Harrison said, and his smile transformed his hard face into something almost beautiful. "We share meals, trade stories. They taught me how to really live in these mountains, not just survive in them." His smile faded. "Point is, someone helped me when I needed it most, expected nothing in return. Figured I'd do the same for others when I could. That's how communities survive out here. We take care of each other." "That's a good philosophy," Eliza said softly. "It's the only one that makes sense to me." He finished the coffee and handed back the cup, still careful. "I'll finish this path, make sure the other buildings are clear, then head back up the mountain before another storm hits." "How do you know another storm is coming?" He pointed to the western sky, where clouds were building dark and heavy against the peaks. "See how the clouds are sitting on the mountains. We'll have snow again by nightfall. Won't be as bad as the last one, but enough to make travel difficult." He paused. "You have enough firewood and supplies?" "Yes, plenty, thanks to you." Something in his expression softened. "Good, stay warm, Miss Fairmont." He was right about the storm. It began snowing again that evening, and Eliza went to sleep watching white flakes drift past her window and thinking about a man who had been saved by strangers and chose to pass that kindness forward, who looked at her with understanding in his eyes and never once made her feel pressured or afraid. December brought Christmas preparations, and the children were wild with excitement, making decorations from pine boughs and paper, practicing songs, begging Eliza for stories about Christmas back east. She found herself caught up in their enthusiasm, grateful for the distraction from her own thoughts. The town planned a Christmas Eve celebration in the church, and Margaret convinced Eliza to help with the preparations despite her reluctance to attend large gatherings. On the afternoon of December 23rd, Harrison Quinn rode into town with a pine tree roped to his pack mule, the largest, most perfect tree Eliza had ever seen. She watched from the schoolhouse window as he delivered it to the church, then spoke briefly with Margaret before mounting his horse and riding toward the schoolhouse. Eliza met him at the door, her heart beating faster than it should. "Mr. Quinn, that's a beautiful tree." "Cut it this morning," he said, staying mounted. "Thought the children would like it." He paused. "Margaret said you were planning to come to the celebration tomorrow night. I said I would help with preparations. I'm not certain about the actual event." Harrison nodded slowly, and she saw understanding in his eyes. "Lot of people, lot of noise, can be overwhelming." "Yes," Eliza admitted, grateful he understood. "I wasn't planning to come either," Harrison said. "Not much for crowds myself." But Margaret made a compelling argument about community and Christmas spirit. He looked down at her from his horse, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Thought maybe if you did decide to come, it might be easier to have a friendly face to stand near. Someone who understands needing space." Eliza stared up at him, at this mountain of a man offering her exactly what she needed without her having to ask for it, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "That would be very kind of you." Not kind, practical. But his slight smile told her he was pleased. "I'll be there by 6. If you come, I'll save you a spot near the door. Easy to step out if you need air." "Thank you, Mr. Quinn." "Harrison," he said quietly. "You can call me Harrison if you're comfortable with that." She tested the name silently, then aloud. "Harrison." The way his eyes lit up at hearing his name in her voice made her feel powerful in a way she had not felt in a very long time. "And you can call me Eliza, when we're not around the children anyway." "Eliza," he repeated, and her name sounded different in his rough voice, like something precious. "That's a good name. Pretty." Then he tipped his hat and rode away before she could see the full extent of her blush. And Eliza went inside with her heart pounding, and her mind racing with the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to heal. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, with the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds. Eliza spent the day helping Margaret and the other women prepare food for the celebration, and when evening came, she took extra care with her appearance, wearing her best green dress and pinning her hair up with the small pearl combs that had been her grandmother's. She told herself it was just for the occasion, not for the possibility of seeing warmth in gray eyes when Harrison looked at her. But she knew she was lying. The church was already crowded when she arrived, filled with the smell of pine and candles and the sound of excited children. Eliza felt her chest tighten, felt the familiar panic start to rise, but then she spotted Harrison standing near the door exactly as he had promised. He wore clean clothes, his hair tied back neatly, and when he saw her, his entire face changed, going soft with something that looked almost like awe. He did not approach her. Instead, he waited, letting her come to him, and when she reached his side, he simply said, "You look beautiful, Eliza." No man had called her beautiful since before everything had gone wrong, and hearing it from Harrison, knowing he meant it without any expectation or demand, made her eyes sting with sudden tears. "Thank you," she managed. "You clean up rather well yourself." His smile was quick and genuine. "Margaret threatened me with bodily harm if I showed up smelling like wood smoke and hoarse. Figure a man doesn't argue with Margaret Dawson when she uses that tone." Eliza laughed, the sound surprising her, and saw Harrison's expression go even softer at the sound. They stood together near the door, not quite touching, and watched the celebration unfold around them. Children sang carols with more enthusiasm than accuracy. People exchanged small gifts and shared food. The Reverend gave a brief sermon about hope and new beginnings that made Eliza's throat tight. Through it all, Harrison stayed beside her, a solid, steady presence that asked nothing except to exist in the same space. When the crowd grew too close and Eliza felt her breathing start to speed up, he murmured, "Want to step outside for a minute?" She nodded gratefully, and they slipped out into the cold night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, the kind of stars Eliza had never seen in St. Louis, and she breathed deeply, letting the panic subside. "Better?" Harrison asked after a moment. "Yes." "I'm sorry, don't apologize," he said firmly but gently. "Everyone has their limits. Smart to recognize yours and take care of yourself." They stood in the cold, their breath making clouds in the air, and Eliza found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "I used to love parties, balls and dinners and all the social events in St. Louis. I was good at them, at talking to people and laughing and dancing." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Now I can barely stand to be in a room with more than a handful of people without feeling like I'm suffocating." "Something happened," Harrison said quietly, not a question. "Yes. Something that made you afraid." Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. "Someone hurt you." She closed her eyes against the tears that wanted to fall. "Yes." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with barely controlled anger. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry you have to carry that weight." "It was my fault," Eliza started, because that was what her mother had told her, what she had been telling herself for a year. "No." Harrison's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Whatever happened, whatever some bastard did to you, it was not your fault. You hear me? Not your fault." Eliza opened her eyes to find him looking at her with such fierce protectiveness that it took her breath away. "How can you know that? You don't know what happened." "Don't need to know details to know that much. I've seen too much of the world, Eliza. I've seen what men can do when they decide their wants matter more than someone else's safety. I've seen women blame themselves for violence done to them, because that's what they were taught to do." His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, but his voice stayed gentle. "Whatever happened, you survived it. You got yourself out here, started a new life, kept going. That takes strength most people don't have." A tear escaped down Eliza's cheek despite her best efforts, and she saw Harrison's entire body tense as though it physically hurt him to see her cry and not be able to comfort her. "I don't feel strong," she whispered. "Strength isn't about not being afraid," Harrison said. "It's about being terrified and doing what needs doing anyway. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Eliza Fairmont." Something broke open inside Eliza at those words, some dam she had been holding in place for a year, and more tears fell, silent and steady. Harrison stood perfectly still, his gray eyes reflecting starlight and something that might have been pain. And Eliza realized that he was suffering too, watching her hurt and respecting her boundaries enough not to reach for her, even though every line of his body said he wanted to. And in that moment, standing in the cold Wyoming night with a mountain man who barely knew her but saw her more clearly than anyone ever had, Eliza made a choice. She took a step toward him, closing half the distance between them, and saw his eyes widen with surprise and hope. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding, for giving me space, for not expecting me to explain or justify or be anything other than what I am right now." "You don't have to thank me for basic human decency," Harrison said, but his voice was unsteady. "Maybe I shouldn't have to, but I do anyway." She took a shaky breath. "I'm not ready for anything, but I want you to know that your kindness means more to me than I can properly express." "I can wait," Harrison said quietly. "However long you need, Eliza. And if you're never ready, that's fine too. I'll still cut your firewood and clear your snow and be your friend if you'll let me." The word friend should have felt like a disappointment, but instead it felt like safety, like possibility, like a foundation on which something else might someday be built. I would like that very much. They stood looking at each other in the starlight, and Eliza felt the world shift around them, felt the future rearrange itself into new patterns. Then the church door opened, and voices spilled out, and they went back inside together, standing side by side until the celebration ended and people began making their way home through the snow. Harrison walked her back to the schoolhouse, keeping a careful distance, and when they reached her door he said, "Merry Christmas, Eliza." "Merry Christmas, Harrison." He tipped his hat and walked away into the darkness, and Eliza went inside feeling something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope. Winter deepened, and Harrison began coming to town more often, always with some practical excuse. He brought meat for her pantry and firewood for her stove. He fixed a crack in her schoolhouse wall that was letting in cold air. He showed up during a particularly brutal storm with extra blankets, and a concern in his eyes that made her chest ache. And slowly, carefully, they built a friendship that felt like the most precious thing Eliza had ever had. They talked about everything and nothing. Harrison told her about his life in the mountains, about the wildlife he saw and the seasons changing and the peace he found in solitude. Eliza told him about her students, about the books she loved, about her dreams of maybe someday opening a real school with proper supplies and a library. They never spoke again about her past or what had driven her west, but it hung between them like a ghost that was slowly losing its power. In late January, Harrison taught Eliza how to shoot a rifle, standing behind her at a careful distance and talking her through the mechanics until she could hit a target 3 times out of 5. "Every woman living out here should know how to protect herself," he said matter-of-factly. And Eliza felt a fierce gratitude for this man who gave her tools to feel safe instead of just promising to keep her safe himself. In February, Eliza helped Harrison treat a wound on his arm from a mountain lion that had gotten too close, and she was surprised to find that touching him in a clinical, purposeful way did not make her flinch. Her hand stayed steady as she cleaned and bandaged the gashes, and when she looked up to find him watching her with wonder in his eyes, she felt a small victory bloom in her chest. "You're not afraid," he said quietly. "I'm terrified," she corrected, but her hands did not shake. "But you're hurt, and I know how to help, and that's more important than being afraid. Like I said before, courage isn't about not being afraid. You would know," Eliza said, tying off the bandage, "living alone in the wilderness, facing down mountain lions." "Mountain lions are easier than people," Harrison said, and there was something in his voice that made Eliza look at him more closely. "What were you running from?" she asked gently. "When you came west?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "My father." He had a temper and fists that moved faster than his brain. "My mother died when I was 12, and after that, there was no buffer." He touched his ribs absently, and Eliza wondered how many times they had been broken. "I stayed until I was 23 because my younger sister needed me. Once she married a good man and moved away somewhere safe, I left. Figured if I stayed, I'd either kill him or he'd kill me, and either way my life would be over." "I'm sorry," Eliza whispered, understanding now why he had recognized her trauma so quickly, why he had known exactly what to say and not say. "Long time ago now. 5 years is enough to dull most edges." He looked at her with those clear gray eyes. "Doesn't go away completely though, does it? The way it changes you." "No," Eliza agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in the quiet of her small living quarters, two damaged people who had found their way to each other across 1,000 miles of wilderness, and Eliza felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble just a little more. Spring came late to Medicine Bow, but when it finally arrived in early April, it transformed the landscape into something magical. Wildflowers bloomed in riots of color, and the mountains lost their heavy caps of snow, revealing green valleys and rushing streams. The children were restless with spring fever, and Eliza found herself taking lessons outside on warm days, teaching botany and geography while sitting in fields of lupine and Indian paintbrush. Harrison still came to town regularly, though now his visits included walks along the creek that ran east of town, always with Eliza's hand tucked in the crook of his arm, never demanding more than she was ready to give. They talked for hours, discovering each other in increments, building trust like a bridge constructed board by careful board. One warm afternoon in late April, they were sitting by the creek watching the water rush past when Harrison said quietly, "I'm falling in love with you, Eliza." Eliza's breath stopped in her chest. She turned to look at him and found his gray eyes steady on hers, open and honest and a little afraid. "I know you're not ready to hear that," he continued. "I know you might never be ready for anything more than friendship. But I needed you to know, because I'm not a man who hides truth." He paused. "You don't have to say anything back. You don't have to feel any particular way about it. I just needed to be honest with you." Eliza's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. A year ago, 6 months ago, even 2 months ago, such a confession would have sent her running. But now, looking at this man who had given her nothing but patience and respect and space to heal, she felt something other than fear. She felt possibility. "I don't know what I feel," she said honestly. "I care about you tremendously. I think about you constantly. When you're near me, I feel safe in a way I haven't felt in a very long time." She twisted her hands together. "But I don't know if what I feel is love or gratitude or just recognition of finding someone who understands." "That's fair," Harrison said simply. "Take your time figuring it out. I'm not going anywhere." But Eliza found she did not want to leave it at that. Some part of her, some brave part she thought had been destroyed, wanted more. "Can I try something?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything," Harrison said immediately. Eliza took a deep breath and reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement the way Harrison always did for her. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, feeling the warmth of him through his shirt. She expected panic, expected her body to betray her with flinching and fear. But instead she felt only the solid reality of him, the proof that he was real and here and choosing her despite all her broken pieces. Harrison had gone perfectly still, barely breathing, and when Eliza looked up at his face she saw such careful, controlled hope there that it made her own eyes sting. "Is this all right?" she whispered. "Eliza," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "You can touch me however you want, whenever you want, but only if you want to, not because you think you should or because you think I expect it." "I want to," Eliza said, and realized it was true. She wanted to know the shape of him, wanted to understand this man who had become so important to her. She let her hand drift from his chest to his shoulder, feeling the muscle beneath, then to his arm, tracing the line of strength there. Harrison stayed frozen, letting her explore, and she saw the effort it cost him in the tension of his jaw, the way his hands were clenched on his thighs. When she reached for his hand, he let her take it. Let her turn it over and trace the calluses on his palm, the scars on his knuckles. "You have good hands," she said softly, "strong and gentle." "They would never hurt you," Harrison said, and it was a vow. Eliza believed him. For the first time since everything had gone wrong, She believed that a man could be strong and still be safe, could want her and still respect her boundaries. "I know," she whispered. They sat by the creek until the sun began to set, Eliza's hand in Harrison's, and when he walked her back to the schoolhouse, he kissed her knuckles with a gentleness that made her knees weak before leaving for his mountain cabin. Eliza went inside feeling as though she had crossed some invisible threshold, as though her life had just expanded into territory she had thought forever lost to her. May brought warmer weather and the end of the school year, and Eliza found herself with time to explore the area around Medicine Bow. Harrison became her guide, showing her hidden valleys and crystal-clear lakes, teaching her to read the signs of wildlife and weather. They spent long days in the wilderness, always returning before dark, and Eliza felt herself growing stronger in body and spirit. One afternoon, they were hiking through a meadow filled with columbine when Harrison said, "Would you like to see my cabin? It's only about an hour's ride from here." Eliza considered the question carefully, knowing what he was really asking. "Will we be alone there?" "Yes." "And you'll bring me back whenever I ask, no questions?" "Of course." Eliza thought about it, thought about the trust she had built with this man over 6 months of careful friendship, thought about the way her heart sped up when she saw him, and the way she had started dreaming about what it might be like to kiss him. "I would like to see your cabin," she said. They rode through pine forests and across rushing streams, climbing higher into the mountains until they reached a valley so beautiful it took Eliza's breath away. Harrison's cabin sat at the edge of a small lake, surrounded by aspens and backed by soaring cliffs. It was larger than she had expected, built from logs he had cut himself, with a covered porch and real glass windows that must have cost him a fortune to haul up from town. Inside was one large room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, a table and chairs, and a bed in the far corner covered with furs. Books lined a shelf on one wall, and Eliza recognized several titles that surprised her. "You have Dickens," she said, running her fingers along the spines. "I like to read," Harrison said, sounding almost defensive. "Just because I live in the mountains doesn't mean I don't value education." "I wasn't judging," Eliza said quickly. "I'm delighted. I just didn't expect to find someone with such excellent taste in literature this far from civilization." Harrison relaxed slightly. "My mother loved books. She taught me to read before I started school. It was one of the few good memories I have of childhood, sitting with her while she read aloud." He paused. "I brought some of her books with me when I left, couldn't bear to leave them behind." Eliza felt her heart squeeze. She walked to where he stood and, with deliberation, reached up to touch his face. Harrison's eyes went wide, and she felt a tremor run through him as her fingers traced the line of his jaw, rough with beard but warm and alive. "You are a remarkable man, Harrison Quinn." "Eliza," he breathed, and she saw hunger and restraint warring in his expression. "What are you doing?" "I'm trying to be brave," she whispered. "I'm trying to reach for something I want instead of always running from what I fear." "And what do you want?" Eliza took a shaky breath. "I want to know what it feels like to be held by someone who cares about me. I want to know if I can bear to be that close to someone without falling apart." She met his eyes. "But I'm terrified, Harrison. I'm terrified that I'll panic and ruin everything." Harrison reached up slowly and covered her hand with his where it rested against his face. "You can't ruin anything. If you panic, we stop. No harm, no judgment, no disappointment." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "I would rather spend the rest of my life standing 3 feet away from you than have you do something you're not ready for." That was what gave Eliza the courage to step closer, to lean into the solid warmth of him. Harrison's arms came around her carefully, holding her loosely enough that she could break away at any moment. and Eliza pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the scent of pine and leather, and something uniquely him. For a moment, panic did flare, her body remembering violence and fear, but Harrison felt nothing like those memories. He was warm and steady and safe, his heart beating slow, and even beneath her ear, his hands gentle on her back. Eliza made herself breathe through the fear, made herself stay present, and slowly, gradually, the panic receded and left something else in its wake. She felt cherished. She felt protected. She felt like maybe, possibly, she could have this after all right. Harrison murmured against her hair. "Yes," Eliza whispered, "more than all right." They stood like that for a long time, and when Eliza finally stepped back, she was smiling. Harrison's answering smile was brilliant, transforming his hard face into something beautiful, and Eliza felt her heart turn over in her chest. "I think I might be falling in love with you too," she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Harrison closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "You have no idea what those words mean to me." "I'm still afraid," Eliza admitted. "I still have days when I can barely stand to be touched. I still wake up from nightmares sometimes." "This is not going to be easy, Harrison." "Nothing worth having is easy," Harrison said firmly. "And Eliza, I don't want easy, I want you. However you come, whatever that looks like. If you need space, I'll give you space. If you need holding, I'll hold you. If you need to talk or cry or rage at the injustice of what was done to you, I'll listen. I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for real." Eliza felt tears spill over, but they were good tears, healing tears. "How did I get so lucky as to find you?" "Pretty sure I'm the lucky one," Harrison said. And then, very carefully, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, chaste and gentle and full of promise. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the cabin, and Harrison made her dinner over his fireplace, showing off cooking skills that surprised her. They talked about the future in hypothetical terms, about what it might look like if Eliza stayed in Medicine Bow long term, about whether Harrison might consider spending more time in town. As the sun began to set, Harrison kept his promise and rode her back to Medicine Bow, and when they parted at the schoolhouse, Eliza kissed his cheek and saw color flood his face. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "Thank you for trusting me," Harrison replied. That night, Eliza dreamed of gray eyes and gentle hands, and for the first time in a year, her dreams were not nightmares. Summer came to Wyoming with long, golden days and warm nights filled with stars. School was out of session, which left Eliza free to spend her days as she wished, and she wished to spend them with Harrison. They fell into an easy routine, with Harrison riding down from his cabin several times a week to take her exploring or fishing or simply to sit on her porch and talk while the sun set. Their relationship deepened slowly, each new level of intimacy hard-won and precious. Eliza learned that she could hold Harrison's hand without fear, could lean against him while they watched the stars, could even kiss him with a sweetness that left them both breathless as long as she was the one who initiated it. Harrison was endlessly patient, never pushing, never demanding, always content to take whatever she could give and ask for nothing more. In late June, Margaret Dawson invited them both to dinner, and Eliza saw the knowing looks that passed between Margaret and her husband when Harrison held Eliza's chair for her and their eyes met with unmistakable warmth. After the meal, Margaret drew Eliza aside while the men talked on the porch. "I'm happy for you," Margaret said simply. "You both deserve good things." "I never thought I would feel this way again," Eliza admitted. "Never thought I could trust a man enough to even want to try." "Harrison is special," Margaret agreed, "and the way he looks at you, Eliza. Like you hung the moon and stars." She paused. Have you two talked about the future? About what happens when school starts again? Eliza shook her head. We've been taking things one day at a time. I think we're both afraid that planning too far ahead will jinx something. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith, Margaret said gently. Sometimes you have to believe that good things can last. That night, walking back to the schoolhouse with Harrison under a sky brilliant with stars, Eliza thought about Margaret's words. When they reached her door, instead of saying good night, she asked, "Do you ever think about the future, about where this is going?" Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about what it would be like to wake up next to you every morning. I think about building you a better cabin with a real study for your books and a classroom for students. I think about children if you wanted them and growing old together in these mountains." He paused. "But I don't want to pressure you. I know you need time." "What if I've had enough time?" Eliza said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "What if I'm ready for more?" Harrison's eyes went wide in the moonlight. "Eliza, you need to be sure. I won't have you rushing into something because you feel obligated." "I'm not," Eliza interrupted. She reached for his hands, gripping them tightly. "I'm not rushing and I'm not obligated. I'm choosing you, Harrison. I'm choosing us." She took a shaky breath. "I'm still afraid sometimes. I still have scars that haven't healed. But I love you, and I want to build a life with you, and I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions." Harrison made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that she could feel the tremor running through him. "Eliza Fairmont, will you marry me?" "Yes," Eliza said, the word muffled against his chest. "Yes, absolutely yes." Harrison pulled back just enough to look at her face, and in his eyes she saw joy and wonder and a love so fierce it took her breath away. "I don't have a ring. I don't have much of anything to offer you except a cabin in the mountains and a heart that's been yours since the day I first saw you." "That's everything I need," Eliza said, and then she stretched up on her toes and kissed him properly, deeply, with all the love and hope and trust she had rebuilt over the past 6 months. Harrison kissed her back with a gentleness that made her knees weak, his big hands cradling her face like she was something infinitely precious, and Eliza felt the last of her walls crumble away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I know the feeling," Eliza said with a shaky laugh, "but I think maybe being scared together is better than being scared alone." "Much better," Harrison agreed. They were married in August by the Reverend in Medicine Bow's small church, with Margaret and her husband standing witness and half the town in attendance. Eliza wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her sew, and Harrison wore new clothes that made him look almost civilized, except for the wild hair he had refused to cut short, and the mountain man beard he had only trimmed. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed Eliza with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly, and Eliza felt her heart swell with happiness she had never thought to feel again. They spent their wedding night at the cabin by the lake, and Eliza was terrified and excited and determined not to let her past ruin her future. Harrison seemed to sense her nervousness, and he took his time, building a fire in the fireplace and making them tea and talking about nothing important until she began to relax. When they finally went to bed, he held her gently and let her set the pace, and Eliza discovered that intimacy did not have to be something to fear, that in the arms of a man who loved her, it could be beautiful and healing and right. There were moments when panic threatened, when her body remembered trauma and tried to shut down, but Harrison was patient and understanding, always ready to stop and hold her until the fear passed. And gradually, Over the course of that night and the nights that followed, Eliza reclaimed something she had thought lost forever. She learned that her body was her own again, that she could experience pleasure without pain, that she could be vulnerable without being violated. In the weeks after their wedding, they settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Eliza moved her belongings to the cabin, and Harrison built her the study he had promised, with shelves for books and a desk by a window overlooking the lake. She continued teaching when school started again in September, riding down to Medicine Bow 3 times a week on the gentle mare Harrison bought for her, spending the other days preparing lessons and reading and exploring the mountains that had become her home. Harrison trapped and hunted and took care of the practical matters of mountain living, but he also carved Eliza a rocking chair for the porch and brought her wildflowers picked from high meadows, and read aloud to her in the evenings while she mended clothes or prepared lessons. They talked about everything, from philosophy to politics to their dreams for the future, and they built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When Eliza's first winter as Harrison's wife settled over the mountains, she found she was no longer afraid of isolation or darkness or being alone with a man. She had Harrison, who held her through nightmares and made her laugh with terrible jokes and looked at her like she was the most amazing thing he had ever seen. She had a home she loved and work that mattered, and a future that stretched out bright with possibility. In February, Eliza realized she was pregnant, and the discovery filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. She told Harrison over dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction, and saw his expression transform through shock to wonder to fierce protectiveness. "A baby," he said, his voice rough. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Eliza asked, suddenly uncertain. Harrison came around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I'm terrified and thrilled and so happy I can barely breathe," he admitted. "Are you all right?" "How do you feel?" "The same," Eliza said with a shaky laugh. "Terrified and thrilled and trying not to think about everything that could go wrong." "We'll figure it out together," Harrison said firmly, "like we figure out everything else. And Eliza, you're going to be an amazing mother." "I hope so," Eliza whispered. As her pregnancy progressed, Eliza found herself dealing with new fears about bringing a child into the world, about whether she could be a good mother after everything she had been through. Harrison was her anchor through it all, patient and supportive and endlessly reassuring. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving animals and flowers into the wood with painstaking care. He read everything he could find about childbirth and infant care, wanting to be prepared to help her. He made sure she ate properly and rested enough, and never let her forget that she was loved. Margaret became an invaluable source of advice and support, having raised 3 children of her own, and Eliza was grateful for the friendship they had built. As summer approached, and Eliza's body changed to accommodate the growing life inside her, she found herself cautiously optimistic about the future. Their son was born in early September on a day when the aspens had just begun to turn gold. The labor was long and difficult, but Harrison stayed with Eliza the entire time, holding her hand and talking her through the pain, and letting her squeeze his fingers until they went numb. When the baby finally arrived, screaming and red-faced and perfect, Harrison cut the cord with shaking hands and placed their son on Eliza's chest with tears streaming down his face. "He's beautiful," Harrison whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one calloused finger. "He's perfect." "He has your eyes," Eliza said, exhausted but elated, seeing Gray staring back at her from a wrinkled little face. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months without agreeing on anything, but now Harrison said without hesitation, "Henry, after my mother's father." He was the only man in my family who was ever kind to me." "Henry Quinn," Eliza tested, liking the sound of it. "Yes, that's perfect." Parenthood was harder than either of them had anticipated, filled with sleepless nights and constant worry, and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. But it was also filled with moments of transcendent joy, watching Henry discover the world, seeing Harrison's fierce love for his son, feeling the three of them becoming a family. When Henry was 6 months old and the worst of winter had passed, Eliza realized that she had stopped flinching when Harrison touched her unexpectedly. She had stopped having nightmares about St. Louis. She had stopped defining herself by what had been done to her and started defining herself by what she had built despite it. She had, without quite realizing when it happened, healed. One evening in early spring, with Henry asleep in his cradle and the fire crackling in the hearth, Eliza curled up against Harrison on the settee he had built for the cabin and said, "I'm happy. Really, truly happy." Harrison pressed a kiss to her hair. "I'm glad. You deserve to be happy." "So do you," Eliza said, tilting her head back to look at him. "Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for letting me come to you in my own time." "I would have waited forever," Harrison said simply. "You were worth waiting for." "I love you," Eliza said, the words as natural as breathing now. "I love you too," Harrison replied. "More than I thought it was possible to love another person." They sat together in comfortable silence, and Eliza thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the broken girl who had arrived in medicine, Beau afraid of her own shadow, to the woman she was now, strong and whole and loved. It had not been an easy road, but it had been worth every hard one step. Over the next few years, their family grew. A daughter named Emma arrived when Henry was 2, and then twin boys named James and John when Emma was 3. The cabin Harrison had built expanded to accommodate their growing family, with new rooms added each time Eliza found herself pregnant again. Harrison proved to be an extraordinary father, patient and playful and fiercely protective, teaching their children to raid and ride and respect the wilderness that was their home. Eliza continued teaching in Medicine Bow, eventually opening a proper school in a larger building that Harrison and other men from town constructed. She earned a reputation as an excellent educator, and families began moving to the area specifically so their children could attend her school. She taught reading and mathematics and science, but she also taught her students, especially the girls, that they were strong and capable and deserving of respect. Medicine Bow grew from a small frontier town into a thriving community, and Eliza and Harrison became respected members of it, known for their generosity and their willingness to help neighbors in need. Harrison never lost his love for the mountains, but he found he could balance his need for wilderness with his love for his family and his commitment to the community that had embraced them. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Eliza with a trip back to the valley where his cabin sat, leaving their 4 children in Margaret's capable care for 3 days. They spent those days hiking and fishing and making love under the stars, reconnecting with the people they had been before parenthood had consumed their lives. "You ever regret it?" Eliza asked on their last night, lying in Harrison's arms on a blanket near the lake. "Marrying someone with so much damage, taking on all my fear and trauma." Harrison propped himself up on one elbow to look at her, his gray eyes serious in the moonlight. "Never, not once, not for a single second." He traced her face with gentle fingers. "You were never damaged, Eliza. You were hurt, and that's different. And watching you heal, watching you become the woman you were always meant to be, has been the greatest privilege of my life." "You saved me," Eliza said softly. "No," Harrison corrected. "You saved yourself." I just gave you space to do it and tried not to get in your way." "That's more than you know," Eliza said. "Most men would have pushed, would have demanded, would have taken offense at my fear. You waited. You let me reach for you first, every single time, even when it must have been hard." "It was the easiest thing I've ever done," Harrison said, "because I loved you too much to want anything you weren't ready to give freely." They made love slowly, tenderly, with the familiarity of a decade of marriage and the passion of two people who had fought hard for their happiness. Afterward, Harrison held Eliza close and said, "Thank you for taking a chance on a broken mountain man." "Thank you for taking a chance on a broken schoolteacher," Eliza replied. "We're not broken anymore," Harrison said. "We're healed. Maybe we have scars, but scars are just proof that we survived." "We're more than survivors," Eliza said. "We're happy." "Yes," Harrison agreed, kissing her forehead. "We're happy." The years continued to pass in a blur of joy and challenge and ordinary domesticity. Henry grew into a serious boy who loved books as much as his mother and the wilderness as much as his father. Emma was wild and fearless, always climbing trees and catching frogs and giving her parents heart attacks with her daring. The twins were inseparable, always getting into mischief together and making the whole family laugh with their antics. Eliza's school flourished, and she eventually trained other teachers to help her, creating an educational system that became a model for other frontier communities. Harrison's reputation as a guide and hunter grew, and he began taking men from back east on expeditions into the high country, earning enough money to ensure his family was comfortable. When Eliza was 35 and Harrison was 40, they sat on their porch one evening watching their children play in the meadow below the cabin, and Eliza said, "We did it. We built something good." "We did," Harrison agreed, his arm around her shoulders. "We built something better than I ever dreamed possible." "Do you think you'll ever regret leaving the solitary life you had before?" Eliza asked. "All this noise and chaos," Harrison laughed, the sound deep and warm. "Not for a second. Turns out I didn't want solitude nearly as much as I wanted you and everything that came with you." He paused. "What about you? Do you regret leaving St. Louis, giving up the refined life you could have had?" "I gave up nothing," Eliza said firmly. "St. Louis took from me. You and this place and our family gave to me. There's no comparison." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Eliza thought about the girl she had been on that stagecoach 12 years ago, terrified and traumatized and convinced her life was over. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that everything would be all right, that she would find healing and love and happiness in the mountains of Wyoming, that the gentle mountain man who cut her firewood would become the great love of her life. But maybe, she thought, some things had to be lived to be believed. Maybe some journeys could not be shortened or made easier. Maybe the hard road was necessary to fully appreciate the destination. As darkness fell and Harrison called the children in for dinner, Eliza felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. She was grateful for the strength that had carried her west. She was grateful for the community that had welcomed her. She was grateful for Margaret's friendship, and for her students, and for the mountains that had become her home. But most of all, she was grateful for Harrison, for his patience and his love and his unwavering belief that she was worth waiting for. That night, after the children were tucked into bed and the cabin was quiet, Harrison found Eliza sitting in her study looking at an old photograph of St. Louis that she had kept all these years. He sat beside her, not speaking, just being present. "I'm not her anymore," Eliza said quietly, touching the image of her younger self in the photograph. "I'm not that scared girl." "No," Harrison agreed. "You're a woman who survived and thrived and built a beautiful life. You're stronger than you ever were before." "Because of you," Eliza said. Because of you, Harrison corrected. I just held space for you to find your way back to yourself. Eliza set down the photograph and turned to her husband, this man who had given her everything she needed and asked for nothing she could not give. I reached for you first, she said, remembering that day by the creek when she had put her hand on his chest. And you waited for me to be ready. Always, Harrison said. I would always wait for you. You don't have to wait anymore, Eliza said, smiling. I'm here, I'm yours. Completely and without reservation. And I'm yours, Harrison said, pulling her into his arms, for as long as we both shall live. They held each other in the quiet of the study, and Eliza felt the truth of their love settle into her bones. This was what healing looked like. This was what it meant to reclaim your life after trauma. This was what happened when someone loved you enough to let you find your own way home. The years continued to roll past, bringing all the joys and sorrows of a life fully lived. There were hard times, winters when illness swept through the community and they lost friends, summers when drought threatened the valley, moments when old fears resurfaced and Eliza had to fight her way through them again. But there were far more good times than bad, birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that somehow became precious memories. Henry went east to university when he was 18, studying literature and philosophy, before returning to Medicine Bow to help his mother run the school. Emma married a young rancher and settled just a few miles away, giving Eliza and Harrison grandchildren to spoil. The twins took after their father, building a cabin together in the high country and making their living as guides and hunters, always happiest in the wilderness. When Eliza was 52, she stood at the front of the expanded schoolhouse and watched as her oldest student, a young woman of 18, graduated with honors and announced plans to attend teachers' college. After the ceremony, the young woman approached Eliza with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Quinn," she said. "You taught me that being a woman doesn't mean being small or quiet or afraid. You taught me that I could be strong and educated and worthy of respect." Eliza hugged the girl, remembering her own journey to that understanding. "You did the work yourself. I just opened doors for you. You opened doors for all of us," the girl said. "You changed this whole community." After everyone had left and Eliza was closing up the schoolhouse, Harrison appeared to walk her home. He had gray in his beard now and lines around his eyes, but he was still the strong, capable man she had fallen in love with, still protective and gentle and utterly devoted. "Proud of you," he said, taking her hand as they walked. "Proud of us," Eliza corrected. "We built this together. The school, the family, the life. Best decision I ever made," Harrison said, "was cutting firewood for a scared schoolteacher and waiting for her to be ready." "Best decision I ever made," Eliza replied, "was getting on that stagecoach and coming west to a little town in Wyoming where a mountain man was waiting to teach me what love really meant." They walked home through the evening light, hand in hand. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary from their broken pieces. Behind them, Medicine Bow settled into night, a thriving community built on hard work and mutual support and the belief that everyone deserved a second chance. Ahead of them, the mountains rose against the darkening sky, eternal and majestic and home. When they reached their cabin, grown now to accommodate visiting children and grandchildren, they sat on the porch in the rocking chairs Harrison had made and watched the stars emerge one by one. Eliza leaned against Harrison's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to communicate their love. "No regrets?" Harrison asked, as he sometimes did. "Not a single one," Eliza replied, as she always did. "You." "Just that I didn't find you sooner," Harrison said. "But then again, Maybe we both needed to go through what we went through to become the people who could build this life together. Maybe, Eliza agreed. I think everything happened exactly as it was meant to. As the night deepened and the air grew cold, they went inside to the warmth of their home. This place they had built with love and patience, and the understanding that healing takes time but is always worth the wait. Eliza looked around at the life they had created. The photographs on the walls showing children and grandchildren, the books on the shelves, the quilt she had made draped over the settee, the worn but comfortable furniture that spoke of years of use and love. This was her happily ever after, she thought. Not perfect, because real life was never perfect, but real and true and earned through hard work and courage and the willingness to reach for love even when fear said to run. She had been the girl who flinched at every touch, and Harrison had been the mountain man who waited until she reached for him first. And together, they had built something beautiful. "I love you," she said to Harrison as they prepared for bed, the words as necessary as breathing even after all these years. "I love you too," Harrison replied, kissing her forehead with the same gentleness he had always shown. "Every day for the rest of my life I will love you." That night, Eliza slept peacefully in her husband's arms, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, and she dreamed of mountains and wildflowers and gray eyes that had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. She dreamed of the future still ahead of them, the grandchildren still to come, the years of quiet contentment waiting to be lived. And when she woke in the morning to sunlight streaming through the windows and Harrison's steady breathing beside her, she smiled and thought, once again, that she was the luckiest woman alive. Not because her life had been easy, but because she had fought for her happiness and won, because she had found a man worth trusting and a love worth fighting for. They spent that day, like most days, in simple domestic contentment. Harrison worked on repairs to the cabin while Eliza tended her garden and prepared lessons for the upcoming school year. They ate lunch on the porch, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. In the evening, their daughter Emma visited with her 3 children, and the cabin filled with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of family. After everyone had left and the cabin was quiet again, Eliza stood at the window looking out at the mountains touched with alpenglow, and Harrison came to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "Impossibly," Eliza replied, leaning back against him. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, that I get to have this, have you have all of it." "You earned every bit of it," Harrison said. "You fought your way through hell and came out the other side, and you built something beautiful from the ashes. I'm just lucky you let me be part of it." Eliza turned in his arms to face him, looking up into the gray eyes that had been her anchor through every storm. "I was the lucky one. You saw me when I was broken, and you didn't try to fix me. You just gave me space to fix myself and stood guard while I did it." "That's what love is," Harrison said simply. "Seeing someone clearly, scars and all, and choosing to stand beside them anyway." They stood together in the fading light, 2 people who had found each other across distance and trauma and fear, who had built a life and a family and a legacy of love that would outlast them both. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, bearing witness to their love story, to the slow, patient healing that had transformed them both. And in that moment, Eliza Fairmont Quinn, formerly the girl who flinched at every touch, felt nothing but peace and gratitude and joy. She had reached for love when everything in her said to run, and love had reached back and caught her and held her safe. She had trusted a mountain man who waited with endless patience for her to be ready, and he had given her the world. This was her ending, she thought. Not an ending really, but a continuation, a promise of tomorrow and the day after and all the days stretching ahead. An ending that was also a beginning, that said love was possible even after the worst had happened, that healing was real and time was kind and patience was the greatest gift one person could give another. As the stars began to emerge and the mountains faded into shadow, Eliza kissed her husband and felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her home. Home to these mountains, home to this man, home to herself at last. And it was, in every way that mattered, perfect.